We're going to begin with a kind of short talk on what's called the biopsychosocial model. And the point of this is that health, disease, illness, and well-being are affected by multiple levels from the cellular to the level of international policy. Um, the biopsychosocial model is generally attributed to an internist named George Engel, who described it in an article in Science, pretty prestigious journal, in 1974. And Engel argued that it was overly reductionistic to simply look at pathophysiology in the typical sense of biochemical or anatomical aberrations and their associated symptoms, that social levels up to that of public policy were directly or indirectly causal factors and also sites for intervention. For example, under Obamacare, the percentage of the population that was uninsured dropped probably by 5 to 7%. It was hovering around 16% or so at the time it was implemented. The result of that change in policy would mean that more women, for example, would get prenatal care earlier in the course of their pregnancy, which would reduce the likelihood of birth complications, premature birth, as well as harm to the mother. One of the current issues in public health in the U.S. that has been very disturbing is that African American women and their newly born babies have particularly high rates of mortality. In fact, the rates of mortality for African American women in the United States are significantly higher than rates in many, many other countries. And you would be expecting it to decrease over time, but it's actually increased. So these kinds of broader social factors certainly impact health. And Engel argued that it was artificial to look at the individual in isolation. So this is a comparison of the two approaches. A strictly biomedical model is highly reductionistic. It looks for specific causes, pathogens, viruses, etc. We know that life is not that simple in the medical world. For example, the etiology of gastrointestinal ulcers has gone through some transitions. In the 50s and 60s, it was thought to be largely due to psychosocial factors and stress. Eventually, it was found that there was particular bacteria, H. pylori, that was involved and seen as etiological in ulcers. And psychosocial explanations kind of went out the window. However, more recent research has suggested some interaction between the two, that many people are walking around with H. pylori but not developing ulcers. Those who are under significant psychosocial stress and have higher levels of H. pylori are more likely to develop ulcers. The other distinction that we'll talk about in this class is the distinction between disease and illness. Disease is the biological explanation for a syndrome or symptoms. Illness is the patient's experience of a condition, loosely put. And that can include the social context that it occurs. Let me just give you an example. We know, for example, with patients with chronic lower back pain, that there is a process somewhere around 3 months after the initial pain was reported. If the pain is still present at about 3 months, there is a shift over to a more complicated explanation for what is keeping the pain alive, so to speak. And that is that somewhere around the 3-month mark after someone has been in chronic pain, the likelihood of depression increases. And also, particularly if they were working in a not so desirable and physically demanding job, what's called secondary gain or patterns of reinforcement seem to take hold. And we know that somebody with chronic lower back pain who's had it for 6 months or more and has not been at work is pretty likely by that point in time not to return to work. The other thing that is interesting about lower back pain is that there does not appear to be any consistent association between cervical pathology or musculoskeletal pathology and patients' reports of pain. Again, a illness focus really cannot account for what happens in the course of chronic low back pain. The biopsychosocial model looks at multiple factors that and multiple levels that we just talked about. And if you're familiar with Uri Brockenbrenner's systems model, which is usually used in developmental psychology, this is pretty similar. The biopsychosocial model does not look for a single cause either. And again, for psychology folks, this is probably not a new idea, in that we know, for example, that major depressive disorder does not have a unitary cause. It's usually a result of genetic predisposition that interacts with particular social circumstances that also may act in conjunction with certain cognitive schema that may be laid down relatively early in life. And so you can't, with most cases of major depressive disorder, you can't point to a very specific narrow cause. This also, as you can see from the slide, puts more of the responsibility, directly or indirectly, on the patient. And one of the factors that has led to that is that we have shifted in the last 50, 60 years from a focus on illnesses which are caused by a specific pathogen, such as tuberculosis, okay, or influenza, to what are called lifestyle diseases. Most of us here in the United States are likely to die of diseases in which lifestyle, what you eat, how much alcohol you drink, how much exercise you get, are going to play a role in those conditions and their relative severity. So this is an example of a case, and I deliberately um, wrote this case myself, and it's based upon, I would say, multiple um, patients that I've seen over the years. This is a 47-year-old Hispanic female and is being seen at a neighborhood health clinic. She's reporting numbness and tingling in her hands and feet, and that her vision is not as good as it once was. It's become more blurry. Hopefully some of you will recognize that those tend to be symptoms of advanced type 2 diabetes, where the person's blood sugar is not under very good control. There probably is a genetic diathesis for type 2 diabetes, but that diathesis may not emerge in the form of illness if the person does lead a low risk lifestyle, meaning that they maintain a healthy body weight, regular physical activity, and a good diet. But in this case, this predisposition manifested. And at today's office visit, it's found that her diabetes is under pretty poor control. And as I said at the end, it's likely that these symptoms are associated with uncontrolled diabetes. Now, you can tell her you can put her on insulin. You can tell her to control her diet. You can tell her to get more exercise. But those factors alone are unlikely to be very helpful unless you look at the broader social and, in this case, cultural context. When you ask her about doing blood sugar checks at home, which you're supposed to do very regularly with a glucometer, she verbalizes a cultural explanation. She said, I used to do it all the time, but I heard from somebody that if I check it too often, my fingers are going to go numb. And in some cases, I've heard people's fingers even turn black. And what's interesting here is that the causal explanation that she has and the biomedical causal explanation are essentially flipped. She's probably needing to check her blood sugar pretty frequently because it's not very stable. However, she has made the association, again, probably based upon reports from other people, that those who are checking their blood sugar highly frequently are more likely to have complications. And she attributes these complications to the act of checking blood sugar. Here's another interesting explanation, and we'll talk about this in the class. It is common in some Latin American cultures to account for type 2 diabetes by something called susto, which means an intense emotional experience. And she says, I didn't have any problems with my sugars until I saw my cousin killed. He got hit by a car right in front of me. I was crying and wailing. I never had any problems with my blood sugar before, but 2 weeks after I saw my cousin get killed, I went to the doctor who told me blood sugars were high. I know it's that shock of seeing my cousin killed that caused me to have diabetes. And susto is a commonly invoked explanation for type 2 diabetes in the Hispanic community. When you ask her about her diet, she says that her husband's very particular about what he eats, and she feels like she should eat the same things as he does. It's interesting if you look in your textbook, and I usually use this as a question on the exam because I find it's interesting, is that in heterosexual couples, um, the couples or family's diet is likely to be determined by the male partner in the relationship. She had been prescribed medication for diabetes in the past, as well as for high blood pressure. They often go together. But about 8 months ago, she lost her job, and she went on the Obamacare online insurance exchanges, which, if you're interested, you can go on and see what different levels of health insurance would cost you. Um, and she says that she can't really afford um, to buy insurance directly through the exchange. Incidentally, for insurance to be affordable to many people by going on the exchange, oftentimes you have to have an incredibly high deductible, like $10,000 deductible, um, to be able to afford the insurance. And also, it often won't cover many things, such as some medications. So, yeah, you can have health insurance, but it really may not cover you very well um, if you don't buy the more expensive plans. You asked her what else she's done, and she says she's been taking some tea that was recommended by a curandera, and that's in Hispanic culture is an indigenous healer. And teas and herbs are common medical interventions that curanderas recommend. When the physician raises the possibility about needing to initiate insulin and needing to initiate it at a higher dose and for it to be injectable, she gets very distressed. She says, "No way. My mom started shooting that insulin and she got worse. Soon after she started that medicine, she had to have her leg amputated." Again, this is kind of an interesting view of causality. Because you're taking insulin more frequently and injecting it, it usually means that you have fairly far progressed diabetes. Um, and you're going to have these complications. Again, in her worldview, there's an association between increasing the dose of this injectable insulin and worsening symptoms of diabetes.